Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to show you guys how you can do some manual panning inside of DaVinci Resolve 16. So there are going to be cases where using a tracker node on the Fusion page won't actually necessarily get you great results because the object you're trying to track is either too small, goes off camera, or something moves in the shot to block it. As a result, if the motion you wanted to create in the camera was something as simple as panning the shot from left to right or top to bottom, in order to follow, say, a chicken's head, then it may actually be easier to do that using a transform node, which we can set up on the Fusion page as well. Okay, so say for this shot, we wanted to zoom in on the chicken's face and to have the shot follow the chicken's head, keeping it relatively centered wherever it goes during this video clip. So we can go over to the Fusion page with the clip in the timeline and add in a transform node in order to make that happen. So I'm going to move the spline out of the way because we don't need it. And then I'm going to select Media In, right-click on the connector line, go to Add Tool, and then do Transform and Transform. So with this Transform node, we can adjust the panning of the shot using a keyframed center X. And in this case, we'd need to increase the size as well, basically zooming in. Since the video clip is already the same dimensions of the final export, if we move it without zooming in first, we would get some blank areas on the side. So we can either use a higher definition shot or zoom in order to have some buffer room for us to pan around. And then go to the frame, in this case for me, frame 0, where you want to set the initial position of the center X. So first on frame 0, we'll get that chicken's head centered on the screen. So I'm going to increase the center Y position until it pans the shot upwards. And then I'm going to click on the keyframe diamond on the right side in order to make that the initial keyframe point. And we can actually bring it down a little bit more. Now that the gizmo is showing for the keyframe, we can get that centered exactly where we want it. Maybe we even want to zoom in on the shot a little bit more just in case we need the buffer. So now with that keyframe, we can hit play on the timeline, and let's drag this node section down because we're not going to need it. And we can also zoom in on the video itself. And we can actually hit play and find the next point in time where this transform should recenter on the chicken's head. So let's hit play a bit and find that frame where things change. So I'm going to pan it over here since the head is right behind that part of the chicken. And I'll keep going forward in the timeline. I guess we can do it frame by frame by hitting left and right on the arrow keys. And that should make it easier to find the points where you should use for keyframes. So I'm going to go down here to the chicken's head one more time, hit right on the keyframing again. And let's get that next point. Increase the size of the shot since we want that bottom to not get cut away. And keep going. So once again, manually setting it for the position wherever the chicken's head is. Let's go up one more time here, creating another keyframe point every time we move. And note that the keyframing is automatic as long as you have the first one set. So as long as you keep following this process, eventually you'll get keyframes which will work for all of the movement inside of your video clip. If you have a period of time where there's not much movement, you can go to the last frame of that no movement area and then manually click on the keyframe button. So between those two keyframes, the transform doesn't move at all. But doing that will make it so that when you do set the movement, it'll only move from the latest keyframe. And that'll give you a more accurate result. So let's move it there. So of course, just kind of repeat this until you get to the end of your clip, however long you want that to be. We can go back to the start and see how it looks right now, hitting play on the timeline. And hopefully the movement should be relatively in line with the chicken's head. If there's any periods where it's not matching exactly, then you can create additional keyframes to make it a little bit more accurate. So for instance, right here, it's a little bit off center. So if I just adjust the position there and play it back one more time with that additional keyframe, the movement should be much more accurate. One more tip I want to point out for this is that since we're talking about movement here, the transform keyframes currently have no curve. They move in a linear fashion. So the velocity is constant between 2 points. But real movement doesn't normally look like that. So instead what we can add to it is an ease curve so that it will start and end slow and look more natural in terms of its movement. So with this clip that we've already gone ahead and keyframed, we can just take all of the keyframes and apply the curve to it. To do that, we open up the spline, and let's expand this a bit so we can see it. I'm going to toggle transform center path 1 displacement over here so that we can adjust it. And assuming you have all of the points created, and what we can do with all these keyframes is to right click and go to ease, the drop down menu, and then we can choose in out cubic as the easing, which will make the bulk of the velocity in the center between two keyframes, and then towards the edges where it almost reaches those keyframe points, it slows down a bit. So it speeds up in the middle and slows down at the edges. And doing that will make it look a little bit smoother and more natural. So let's go ahead and play this back now with the cubic easing added. Now, of course, we can go in and add a couple more keyframes and remember to set them all to the same easing. But more or less, we've done a pretty decent manual job of tracking the chicken's face across time. So if you run into a situation where the tracker tools don't work, for instance, if some object goes behind another object and the tracker would normally lose sight of that, then you can always get around it by using a manual panning transform and doing it by hand. So just to point out, with this transform adjustment, we can also apply that to any other effects that come after that inside of our node setup. So for instance, if I was to set up a blur over here, and this blur is already centered on the chicken's head using this ellipse tool, but we feed the transform into that blur, then it's going to adjust the position of the blur across time as well with the same movements. So if I hit play here, you can see that the blur also follows the chicken's head around as the shot continues. So there's more than one use for the transform, obviously, if you control it like this. Just note that you'll probably need to do a little bit of troubleshooting, going back and fixing keyframes like right here, in order to make it just right for your video clip. But with a little bit of time, you should be able to get a pretty good manual result. So that's pretty much going to be it for this video on doing manual transform panning inside of DaVinci Resolve. I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future video content.